Barbara's harsh words. About my attendance at her graduation, likening my presence to a potential embarrassment, left me reeling. She feared that my being there would turn me into the subject of ridicule. Her blunt message conveyed not just a request to stay away, but also a painful reminder of the gap between us. As I was reflecting on her words, Barbara's urgent call caught me off guard. Her voice, filled with haste and anxiety, demanded my immediate return home, indicating some distress. This call was a stark contrast to the note she had left, showing a different side of her that seemed to panic easily. My name is Nancy, a 41-year-old who balances a part-time job at a real estate agency with raising my stepdaughter, Barbara, and managing household tasks. My marriage to Samuel, Barbara's father, 10 years ago, marked a significant change in my life. Samuel was a widower, something I learned shortly before our wedding. Despite the shock, my decision to marry him was driven by a desire to provide Barbara with a stable and caring environment. Our meeting at a construction company where I worked and Samuel was a client had led to a relationship built on mutual respect and affection. Over the years, I've dedicated myself to being a supportive part of Barbara's life, with the hope of guiding her into adulthood as a well-rounded individual. This journey, however, has not been without its challenges. Barbara's transition from a shy child to a teenager who openly expresses disdain towards me, often referring to me as old lady, has been particularly difficult. Despite her harsh treatment and critical remarks, I've continued to perform my duties with levée and patience, hoping for a change in her attitude. The day Barbara criticized me for improperly handling her laundry was a typical example of the tension between us. Her sharp words, "You're so useless," cut deep. Yet I remained silent, choosing not to defend my actions or confront her rudeness. This incident, like many others, reflected the complexity of our relationship, a mix of caregiving and conflict, with my efforts to connect often met with rejection. In this context, Barbara's blunt request for me not to attend her graduation felt like a culmination of years of strained relations. It wasn't just the fear of embarrassment that her words conveyed. It was a deeper reflection of how she saw our relationship. Despite the challenges, my commitment to her well-being remained unchanged, driven by the initial promise I made to myself and Samuel, to be a positive influence in Barbara's life, regardless of the personal sacrifices it entailed. As time passed, the dynamic within our household shifted dramatically. Samuel, once known for his ever-present smile and cheerful demeanor, especially during his sales pitches, began to exhibit a change. His smiles became rare at home, and his mood turned noticeably more somber. He started addressing me impersonally, a shift that seemed to set a precedent for Barbara. Witnessing this change in both of them, I couldn't help but wonder if I was somehow falling short in my role within the family. This thought spurred me into action. I became even more diligent with my household responsibilities and took extra care in overseeing Barbara's upbringing, hoping she would mature into a respectful individual. Despite my efforts, Barbara's attitude toward me only deteriorated, with her calling me old lady, becoming an everyday occurrence. The appreciation I once hoped for from her vanished entirely. Interestingly, Barbara's behavior was drastically different outside the confines of our home. At school events during her elementary years, she acted completely normal, not showing any signs of rudeness. Samuel, too, would engage with her normally, even managing to smile on occasion. This stark contrast made it clear that their unpleasant behavior was reserved exclusively for me, deepening the hurt I felt. Samuel's transformation was equally perplexing. The man who used to share household chores and advocate against the idea that a stay-at-home spouse should bear all domestic responsibilities now seemed to have forgotten those principles. The balance we once shared in managing household tasks shifted entirely onto my shoulders. Samuel's criticisms became a regular part of my life. He blamed me for not keeping the house in perfect order, despite the increased workload. His remarks, ranging from the accumulation of dust on the stairs to the shortage of toilet paper, were delivered with a contempt that was hard to bear. The shift was stark from the early days of our marriage when housework was a shared duty. Now, any attempt to discuss this imbalance or express my feelings was met with dismissal or seen as a reflection of my inadequacies. Samuel's constant belittlement over my housekeeping skills left me feeling devalued and hopeless. His comments, implying my inability to learn or improve, weighed heavily on me. Each apology I offered was met with further disdain. and his exaggerated sighs of frustration only served to emphasize his dissatisfaction with me. As Barbara approached her 19th birthday, I found myself increasingly detached from both her and Samuel. My attempts to engage in conversations about her future plans or express interest in her life were met with silence or avoidance. Despite this, I couldn't suppress my curiosity about her aspirations post-graduation. By chance, I overheard a conversation between Barbara and Samuel, discussing her college prospects on a recommendation. This snippet of information, though acquired unintentionally, was a rare glimpse into her life outside our strained interactions. This growing divide within our household painted a somber picture of my reality. The dream of a harmonious family life seemed more like a distant fantasy, leaving me to navigate a lonely and challenging path forward. Hearing Barbara's voice filled with gratitude towards her father was a stark contrast to how she ever spoke to me. "I got a scholarship thanks to you, Dad." "Thank you," she exclaimed, her happiness evident. The words that followed cut deep. "All the chores we piled on that clueless housekeeper really paid off," they joked, unmistakably referring to me as the housekeeper. Their laughter, mocking and light, echoed as I retreated to the bathroom, the only place I could find solitude. There, I broke down, overwhelmed by the realization of how Samuel and Barbara truly viewed me. For a decade, I had poured my heart into this family, enduring the pain and isolation, hoping to be a good mother to Barbara and a supportive wife to Samuel. Despite the endless cycle of chores and the emotional toll it took on me, I pushed through, motivated by the fear of becoming irrelevant to them. My efforts to keep the household running smoothly were driven by a desire to be needed, even as it became increasingly clear that my presence was taken for granted. The revelation of Barbara's graduation, which I learned about through a neighbor, added to the feeling of exclusion. The fact that I was kept in the dark about such an important event underscored my isolation within my own home. Restricted from using modern communication tools and left out of school communications, I was alienated from the community and even from the milestones in Barbara's life. When Barbara returned home to find me in distress and accused me of bringing gloom to the house, it sparked a rare moment of confrontation from me. Her response, indifferent to my feelings and expressly forbidding me from attending her graduation, was a clear message. I was not considered part of the family, but rather an embarrassment. That evening, seeing Samuel prepare for the graduation without having informed me further, cemented my place as an outsider. His pitying look, mixed with a smirk, was a painful reminder of my predicament. I had harbored a faint hope that perhaps for this significant occasion, things might be different, that there might be a place for forgiveness and inclusion. Yet, Barbara's words and Samuel's actions made it painfully clear that I was nothing more than a nuisance in their eyes, dispelling any illusions I had about my role in this family. This realization forced me to confront the harsh truth of my situation. Despite my sacrifices and the love I had given, I was not seen as a family member, but merely as an accessory to their lives, easily dismissed and overlooked. The dream of being part of a happy, united family seemed more distant than ever, leaving me to grapple with the question of my worth and place within the home I had tried so hard to nurture. In that moment of clarity, I acknowledged a truth I had long ignored. My heart had reached its breaking point long before. The following day, as Samuel and Barbara set off to celebrate her high school graduation without me, Samuel's casual mention that they would dine out, explicitly excluding me, became the catalyst for a decision I had been contemplating. The old me, who would have silently borne such dismissals, no longer existed. That very night, I had resolved to leave, a decision that propelled me into action the moment they left the house. With swift movements, I packed my belongings, penned a note detailing my decision to sever ties with them, and departed from what was no longer my home. My destination was my parents' residence, situated a couple of hours away by train. There, I intended to seek their support in legally disentangling myself from Samuel and Barbara. The note I left was clear. I sought independence and suggested that any further discussions be conducted through legal representation, a detail I was yet to finalize but confident in my ability to do so with my father's assistance. My parents' home, a testament to their wealth and influence, promised not just refuge but also the resources needed to navigate this tumultuous chapter. My father, a respected figure with vast real estate holdings, had the means and connections to assist me, including access to competent legal counsel. As I confided in him, The emotional release was overwhelming, yet his response was one of understanding and support rather than the criticism I had feared. The resolution was swift. Plans were set in motion to reclaim and demolish the house Samuel and Barbara lived in, a property that, unbeknownst to Samuel, remained in my father's ownership, a gift whose strings were now being pulled. My father's actions were decisive, a reflection of his support, and a testament to the gravity of my situation. During that 2 weeks, as legal consultations began and the reality of my decision sunk in, the support of my family was unwavering. Sharing my story with my mother, we found solace in our shared tears and determination. Discussions about my future with my father focused on rebuilding and moving forward, a daunting yet necessary endeavor. The night before the scheduled demolition, my phone became a conduit for Barbara's and Samuel's panic and confusion. Incessant calls that I initially chose to ignore. Yet, avoidance was no longer an option I wished to entertain. Confronting them was essential, not just for legalities, but for my own closure. Answering the call, I was immediately met with Barbara's accusatory and panicked tone, demanding my return and questioning the note I had left. It was a moment filled with irony. After years of neglect and derision, they sought my presence. Preparing myself for this conversation, I realized it was not just about addressing their immediate shock, but also about affirming my own worth and the new path I had chosen. This step, though fraught with emotional turmoil, was a declaration of my independence and a rejection of the roles they had imposed upon me. It was time to close this painful chapter and embrace the freedom and peace that awaited, with the support of my family and the strength I had rediscovered within myself. Hearing the urgency in Samuel's voice on the other side of the phone, I could sense their panic. It amused me to think of Barbara's probable dismay upon returning home, expecting to offload her stress onto me, only to be greeted by the silence of my absence and the stark reality of the note I left behind. The irony of her. Facing such turmoil on the day meant to celebrate her achievements brought a subtle smile to my face. Her confusion was palpable when I answered the phone with a question that feigned ignorance, prompting her to fumble over her words before I decided to end the call. Subsequently, I reached out to the real estate management company to confirm the schedule for the demolition, which was set for the following day. However, I requested a slight delay, pushing it to the day after next, to give Samuel and Barbara an additional day. A day I anticipated Samuel would use to confront me directly. Ignoring their persistent attempts to contact me, I prepared for their inevitable visit. As expected, Samuel and Barbara arrived the next day, their arrival announced by the persistent doorbell and knocking. They seemed hurried, likely frustrated by the lengthy and inconvenient journey to my doorstep. Prior arrangements had been made for my parents to remain unseen, creating the impression of my solitary presence. I welcomed them into the living room, where Samuel's unease was evident, a stark contrast to Barbara's brazen demeanor, which lacked any semblance of intimidation towards me. Barbara's impatience grew as I took my time serving tea, prolonging the moment before finally sitting across from her. Her attempt to dominate the conversation was clear as she demanded explanations, referring to my previous act of ignorance on the phone as a poor performance. Her discomfort became more visible under my steady gaze, leading her to label me dismissively in an effort to regain control of the situation. Despite the harshness of her words, I noted the insecurity behind her facade. Samuel's silence throughout this exchange was telling, he observed, waiting to see how the situation unfolded. When Barbara attempted to persuade me to return by belittling me, I responded with a calmness that contrasted sharply with her agitated state. My declaration that they were not my family seemed to catch her off guard, prompting a desperate look towards Samuel for support. Samuel's confidence only surfaced once he believed we were alone, echoing Barbara's sentiments that I couldn't possibly manage without them. His sudden boldness only highlighted his true character, a man of meager spirit, easily swayed by the presence or absence of authoritative figures. My stance remained unyielding. To me, they were strangers, not family. A true family would never subject one of its own to the treatment I endured. A decade of servitude reduced to a mere outlet for their frustrations. This realization that I had mistaken obligation for familial bond was a pivotal moment. I had clung to a promise made at the sight of a young Barbara, believing in a duty to raise her well. But now, with her graduation behind us, I recognized the extent of my sacrifice and the necessity of reclaiming my independence. This confrontation, then, was not just a farewell, but an affirmation of my newfound resolve to no longer define myself by their needs, but by my own worth and aspirations. I had always envisioned that Barbara's transition from high school to her next chapter might serve as a turning point for us. There was a sliver of hope within me that Samuel and Barbara's attitudes might transform for the better by the time of her graduation, that they might finally see and treat me as part of their family. Should that change have occurred, I was prepared to continue our journey together. However, their actions only solidified my resolve to step away, a decision cemented on the eve of Barbara's graduation ceremony. Now facing them, I adopted the stance that they were no longer my kin, thereby extinguishing any remaining familial bonds. In a desperate shift of tactics, Barbara abandoned her usual dismissive term for me and resorted to calling me Mom, a ploy to evoke a sense of familial obligation. Her plea for me to reconsider, paired with Samuel's silent observation, was a stark departure from her earlier defiance. Yet, despite her attempts to appeal to a shared history, my decision remained firm. I was unmoved by her tears and pleas, especially when it became evident that her primary concern was the loss of the house, a material possession, over our relationship. Their appeals and Samuel's subsequent outrage when faced with the reality of the situation did little to sway me. Samuel's demand to halt the demolition, fueled by anger, was met with my calm yet firm refusal. It was clear they were unable to grasp the concept that our familial ties had been severed by their actions, not my departure. Samuel's frustration peaked with a physical display of anger, but even this did not elicit the response he hoped for. My patience had been worn thin by years of neglect and mistreatment, and no number of last-minute apologies could mend what had been broken. The realization that I had endured a decade of being marginalized, mocked, and used was a bitter pill to swallow. The loneliness and pain of being an outsider in what was supposed to be my own family were emotions they could never comprehend. Their shock at my resolve, mirrored by my own self-mocking smile, highlighted the chasm between our perceptions. Samuel's apology, though seemingly sincere, came too late to make any difference. The foundation of trust and respect I had longed for had crumbled beyond repair. Barbara's echoed apologies, pleading for forgiveness and a return to a family that never truly was, fell on deaf ears. This encounter wasn't just a farewell, but a declaration of independence from a relationship that had been one-sided and destructive. My past with Samuel and Barbara was marred by neglect and exploitation, and their last-ditch efforts to claim. Familial bonds were nothing more than attempts to salvage their own comfort at my expense. The realization that I had allowed myself to be treated this way for so long was both liberating and nauseating. As I stood my ground, rejecting their apologies and pleas, I closed the door on any possibility of reconciliation. My identity and well-being were no longer tied to their approval or presence. Moving forward, I was determined to embrace a future defined by self-respect and freedom from the chains of a toxic past. Samuel and Barbara's attempts to acknowledge their guilt, while necessary for their own conscience, would not dictate my path forward. In declaring myself a stranger to them, I also liberated myself from the burden of their expectations and mistreatment, ready to embark on a new journey of self-discovery and healing. The moment they attempted to manipulate me with familial ties, after a decade of indifference, was almost laughable. The idea that I would simply return to them, that we could be a family again after such a prolonged period of neglect, was unfathomable. My emotions, long suppressed in an effort to maintain peace, now surged to the surface, fueling a tirade of truths I had never dared to voice. The words that escaped me were raw, unfiltered expressions of my long-held grievances. I declared unequivocally that there was no trust left, no possibility of us ever resembling a family again. In a decisive move, I placed the divorce papers before Samuel, my signature already marking my commitment to this course of action. I demanded. He signed them there and then to finalize the separation that was long overdue. Samuel's reaction, a mixture of denial and a patronizing smile, only served to affirm my decision. His attempt to sway me with a smile, a tactic that once might have worked, now revealed the depth of his superficiality. Rising from my seat, I called for my parents, who emerged to confront the scene with a gravitas that immediately altered the atmosphere. Samuel's attempt to shift the blame onto me, to paint my actions as a misdeed, was ludicrous. My father's sharp rebuke cut through the room, dismissing Samuel's narrative and exposing the truth of his character. As my father turned his scrutiny towards Barbara, revealing her misconduct at school alongside Samuel's financial deceit. Within his company, the room tensed further. These revelations, uncovered through my initiative to bolster my divorce case, laid bare the extent of their transgressions. Their reactions, devoid of any genuine remorse, underscored their true natures, self-serving and unrepentant. My mother's intervention brought the confrontation to its culmination. Her directive was clear: sign the divorce papers and vacate our lives. Samuel's response, a blend of tears and incoherent mutterings, was a pitiful sight, yet it elicited no sympathy from me. After years of enduring their caloseness, witnessing their final unraveling in the face of incontrovertible truth was a stark reminder of the distance between us. This encounter wasn't just about ending a marriage or severing ties. It was a declaration of my emancipation from a life of being marginalized and exploited. The path forward would be one of rebuilding, away from the shadows cast by Samuel and Barbara's deceit. As they faced the consequences of their actions, I stepped into a future unburdened by their presence, ready to rediscover my sense of self and purpose beyond the confines of their manipulation. Reluctantly but ultimately without a choice under my father's firm gaze, Samuel signed the divorce papers. I couldn't help but notice the time. It was nearing 8 p.m., and the last train was scheduled to depart at 8:45 p.m. In our small town, missing this train meant no departure until the next day, with no taxis to offer an alternative. Samuel and Barbara, likely having assumed they could change my mind, were unprepared for this turn of events. Barbara's reaction to the situation took us by surprise. She defensively suggested that since the divorce was initiated by me, perhaps alimony should be considered, a bold claim after everything that had transpired. My parents were visibly taken aback by her audacity, especially given the circumstances that could be likened to domestic abuse. When challenged for proof of her and Samuel's behavior, I presented a diary I had maintained since the start of our marriage. Barbara's skepticism about the diary's validity as evidence was quickly dispelled when I mentioned that it had been recognized by our lawyer as significant evidence. Realizing their situation, Samuel and Barbara appeared defeated. With a glance at my watch, I noted that they had indeed missed their last chance to catch the train home. My mother couldn't hide her satisfaction, pointing out the lack of transportation options and nearby accommodations. We then insisted they leave our home immediately. From the balcony, I watched Samuel and Barbara hasten towards the station, a futile effort given the train's schedule. This departure marked a pivotal moment of liberation for me, despite some unresolved matters that lingered. In a twist of fate, Samuel and Barbara found themselves without shelter for the night, eventually securing a hotel room after a lengthy walk. The next day, they returned to find the demolition in progress, managing to retrieve only their personal clothing. Unknown to them, I had arranged for the storage of the furniture, appliances, and my belongings. The divorce proceedings concluded swiftly, with the alimony claim settled. Samuel, faced with legal pressure and his company's knowledge of his embezzlement, complied with the financial settlement. Both Samuel's professional downfall and Barbara's academic and social fallout were confirmed by the detective agency. With Samuel now unemployed and confined to a modest apartment, and Barbara, having left high school, their strained relationship devolved into constant bickering, as observed by the detective. Meanwhile, I embraced a new beginning, leaving my job at the real estate agency to join my father's business in resort property management. This transition to a life surrounded by nature, along with the companionship of my new dog, has brought me a sense of peace and fulfillment. For now, this dog represents my family, and together, we look forward to a serene existence, leaving the turmoil of the past behind.